Hello and welcome to Aspects of History. I'm Oliver Webb Carter and I'm the editor. If you're new to Aspects of History, we're a magazine and website dedicated to history and historical fiction. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com where you'll find articles, interviews, book reviews and short stories, and they're all absolutely free. Our magazine is at the insanely cheap price of under a tenner for a year's subscription, and that's under a tenner in American as well. Anyway, on to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please give it a great rating. It'll help us carry on running them. In this week's Aspects of History podcast, we have Andrew Roberts, acclaimed historian and author of Churchill Walking with Destiny, Napoleon the Great, Napoleon and Wellington, and Masters and Commanders. He discusses the subject of his new book, George III, who reigned during tumultuous episodes in world history, including the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars, and all the while dealing with a severe mental illness. I hope you enjoy our chat, and please do subscribe and give us a great rating if you do. So, Andrew Roberts, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast.
Thanks very much indeed, Oliver. It's great to be on the show, and many congratulations with what you've done with Aspects of History, which is great already.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Well, today we're discussing the subject of your new book, which is out very soon, The Longest Reigning King in Britain's History, George III. Now, the title of the book is George III, The Life and Reign of Britain's Most Misunderstood Monarch. So, Andrew, he's much maligned, dismissed as the Mad King, and I'm sure we'll get onto that later. But what made you want to write about him, and why is he misunderstood, as as the title of your book states?
Well, I think the three things that we know about George III, that his obstinacy lost us the American colonies, that he had porphyria, and that, as we've been taught recently by the musical Hamilton, he was also a authoritarian and a sort of vicious figure. All three of those things are completely and utterly untrue. And so when one works on the new papers that have been made available, 100,000 pages of them by the Queen in the wonderful Georgian Papers programme at King's College London, one recognises that actually this is an enlightened monarch. He is a Renaissance prince in many ways, and he didn't have porphyria. And although we, of course, did lose the American colonies, it wasn't his fault. So, this, I think, sets him up perfectly for being regarded as wildly, as you say, maligned and much misunderstood.
Well, starting early on with his life, the Hanoverian monarchs famously didn't get on with their eldest son, but George's father, Frederick, died when he was 13. What was George's relationship with Frederick and also his grandfather, George II?
They were very good with his father. He loved his father and his father loved him. They had a true and proper and strong bond. And indeed, I argue in this book that his father's memory played a very large part in the kind of young king and then later king that George III became. His relations with his grandfather, George II, were abominable, terrible. George II would hit him and abuse him. And in fact, he hated George II so much that he never visited Hampton Court or Kensington Palace, which is where George II lived. And when there was a rumour that Hampton Court had burnt down, he said, good, which is a pretty strong reaction. But one can understand why, because actually when his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died in 1751, George II was so dilatory about bothering to get round to actually having a funeral at Westminster Abbey, that Frederick, Prince of Wales's corpse was left to decompose in the room directly above the young Prince George's. It must have been an absolutely horrific stench that came from this decomposing corpse, and that was his grandfather's fault.
That's not very nice at all. So
I'm glad you agree.
Yes, extraordinary. Now, George was the first Hanoverian born in Britain, and I think the first to speak English as a first language.
How important was this to him, but also how important was it to Britain itself?
Not only as his first language, but also without a German accent, which is important. And it was tremendously important to him because he made such a fuss of it. In his first speech to Parliament, he spoke of being born and bred a Briton. And that really is an important aspect. There are medals that were minted to boast of the fact that that this king was British born and bred.
And for the country itself, what was their view of this Hanoverian monarch born in Britain, a Briton? What was the impact on the country itself?
Well, he was very popular. He started off as one of the most popular kings. He was young, he was relatively good looking, he was unmarried, so he had the opportunity of making an alliance. The very fact he was born at all meant that there wasn't going to be, likely to be another uprising in the way that there had been 15 years before his birth with the Jacobites. And so by the time he comes to the throne in 1760, there is a sense of continuity and therefore peace. So people were happy. Plus, George II wasn't a particularly popular monarch. He had been the last British monarch, as we know now, to have led his troops into battle. He was a brave man, but he was not a popular man. He was a bit of a brute, frankly.
Now, George comes to the throne in 1760, midway through the 7 Years' War, which ends in victory for Britain over France in America. But how much did that success, which secured the colonies and their lands, lead to the American War of Independence?
Oh, well, it was absolutely profound. It was crucial because what it effectively did, the incredible victory in 1763, meant that there were no French threats, strategic threats to the 13 British colonies in America from anywhere closer than Haiti. And so suddenly it meant that the colonists, apart from, of course, the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans in the West, had no threats. And that meant that they could credibly take on Britain and grasp their independence and their sovereignty. They had every capacity to rule themselves as a nation state. They had a strong economy. They had 2.5 million people, of course, 600,000 of whom were enslaved people in the colonies, but nonetheless, they were a viable economic setup. And so by the time that Britain won that war, it had effectively, in a sense, won it too successfully, because it meant that the 13 colonies could secede without any danger, apart from us, obviously.
Now, this really comes out in the book, in that the impression I strongly get from the book is that it's almost an unstoppable force, this desire for nationhood from the Americans, that really George's any actions that George could take weren't really going to stop what the colonists were after. And there are a succession of communications between the colonies and the government, or the king, and I'm really getting at things like the Proclamation of 1775, which I think was received after an olive branch that came from the Second Congress.
It wasn't the Second Continental Congress. Yes, it was. It was called the Olive Branch Petition, but it didn't really hold out an olive branch, really. In that it repeated the demands essentially for sovereign independence, and it was a take it or leave it thing. And of course, by that stage, it was impossible to accept that. The proclamation was the only real response that a constitutional monarch could take, because, and I do go through this book again and again, pointing out how constitutional George III was, and the reason was that he couldn't recognize the Second Continental Congress. And if you can't recognize the Congress, then you can't accept a a petition from it, and you have to make the proclamation, which was very clearly, obviously true, especially by April, when you have Americans firing on British troops at Lexington and Concord, that they were in a state of rebellion. And so some of the people, especially Americans, who complained bitterly at the time about that proclamation, which was only, of course, sent on the agreement of the King's ministers. This wasn't something where George III, drew it up himself. He just signed it at the bottom. Nonetheless, there's not a word in it that isn't true. Of course, the Americans were in rebellion by that stage.
So we move on to the Declaration of Independence. Now, it's very interesting. In your book, you mentioned that references to slavery were removed from the Declaration of Independence, presumably because 41 of the 56 signatories owned slaves. But George himself seemed to be disturbed by this practice of slavery as a young man. But during his reign, he didn't really interfere with it. Why was that?
Well, yes, one of the most interesting things that I found in this, whilst researching this book, was this essay that George wrote in the 1750s when he was Prince of Wales, completely execrating slavery. He said that the arguments for it were ludicrous and ridiculous, and it was an institution worthy of execration. And as you say, unfortunately, during his reign, he didn't do anything to abolish slavery. But this is, again, part and parcel of what I mentioned earlier. He was a constitutional monarch. There wasn't a majority for the abolition of slavery itself, as opposed to the slave trade, during his reign. Indeed, there wasn't until 1820, in the late 1820s, early 1830s. So you can't expect, first of all, on the one hand, you can't complain and argue that George III is a tyrant, and then point out that he was stuck to rigidly to the House of Commons. There was only one occasion when he put in a prime minister who didn't have the majority in the House of Commons, who himself almost immediately afterwards in the general election did. So, there's very little he could do. The other thing is, of course, that about a third of our government revenues came at the time from the West Indies. And they couldn't work out a way to make the West Indies pay as an agricultural economy without the institution of slavery. Now we know, and they knew at the time, and George III knew what a morally appalling and monstrous system it was. But if it was that, or not having enough ships for the Royal Navy, I'm afraid what they did was to put what they saw as national interest before the moral duty of every Christian to get rid of this terrible practice. You can criticize George III for it, of course you can, but I think that we ought to remember that personally he never owned a slave, never bought a slave, never invested in the companies that did that. And of course, he did sign the abolition of the legislation for the abolition of the slave trade. So in that morally very perverted century, he wasn't the worst of them by any means whatsoever.
And I think during the War of Independence itself, the king signed off on the freeing of slaves that had been released during the War of Independence to take up arms against the colonists. Is that correct?
Yes, that was a military thing primarily, of course. And only about 200 slaves did do that in Lord Dunmore's Virginia. But and what they didn't do, of course, was to arm the slaves en masse down in the South, which would have created a social revolution as well as a political one. And they decided not to go down that route. So I'm not for one moment presenting George III as a kind of liberator of the slaves. Of course he wasn't, but he did have a far more liberal attitude than the American colonists. And also, of course, at the time of the handing over of New York, the British did make sure that all the runaway slaves were allowed to get to Canada rather than fall back into the hands of their previous masters.
So the War of Independence itself has been characterized, and as you mentioned earlier, as a war against tyranny, I guess in the figure of George III. And then there's the famous phrase, "No taxation without representation." Now, I learned in my A levels that the 7 Years' War was an expensive conflict. It required the American colonies themselves to pay for their upkeep and protection, which I think on this side of the Atlantic was viewed as pretty reasonable. So which is right?
Well, the extraordinary thing about the no taxation without representation thing is that two of the delegations to the Stamp Act Congress actually had rules, had orders from their states not to accept any offers of representation. So they were complaining they were being taxed without being represented. But even the offer of representation from the British was going to be turned down. It would have been very difficult, of course, to have had American MPs sitting in the House of Commons. We did it, of course, later on in the century with the Irish, but they only had to cross the Bristol Channel rather than the Atlantic Ocean. And so I think that the no taxation without representation thing has been taken one stage too far. And anyway, in America today, if you live in Washington, D.C., you get taxed, but you don't get represented. So there's an element of hypocrisy to it. But no, the important thing, as you mentioned, was that all the money that was going to be raised by the Stamp Act was going to be spent in America, in the colonies, for the protection of the colonists in the West. So, and it was a tiny amount of money as well. They were only raising between $40,000 and $50,000, pounds, at a time when the colonists were only taxed about 2% of what the British were anyhow, and also between 2.5 million, or at least if you strip out the slaves, the 1.9 million tax-paying Americans, £50,000 was absolutely a tiny amount of money. It was a matter of a dollar or so per person per year.
Right. So I recently watched the John Adams HBO series, in which the founding father, later the second president, and ambassador to the court of St. James meets George, and I think this was in 1785. It's an interesting scene, but how was the king's relationship with America after its independence? I mean, in the Alan Bennett play and Hollywood movie, George is depicted as not even wanting to discuss the US.
Well, that's completely wrong. The Adams show, the HBO series, has him as being sort of pretty ill-tempered and difficult, whereas the exact opposite was true. At that meeting in June 1785, he told Adams that yes, he had been the first to among the first to contest the secession, but he was also the first to welcome America with open arms and want to be friendly with it. He said of George Washington that he was the greatest man on earth at one point, and so it's so difficult, therefore, to go along with any of these people like Thomas Paine or indeed Hamilton the musical, in which he's made out to be some vicious and aggressive figure. It's true that he talked about, he didn't like to harp on about the loss of the colonies. Of course he didn't. It was his greatest defeat. He did mention it on one or two occasions when he had gone mad, but that's the raving of a lunatic rather than somebody who has got any serious points to make. So I think there again, he treated it as a fait accompli in a very positive way, really.
So moving on to the man himself and the institution of the monarchy, it's during George's reign that we see constitutional monarchy develop in a way that we may well recognise today. How much was that down to the king himself?
I think quite a great deal. He wasn't a constitutional monarch in the way that we have them today. Of course, he did appoint governments and or at least prime ministers. He did relate directly to cabinet ministers, not going through the prime minister. On that one occasion that I mentioned, he appointed William Pitt the Younger when he didn't have the support of the House of Commons. And so, he was a much more hands-on king than Elizabeth II. However, that said, he had a profound respect for the Constitution. I mean, understandably so, it gave him very wide powers. But he was not anything like the previous monarchs. He was somebody who, in the course of his career, and obviously his lunacy, did help the politicians a good deal to take on powers that they didn't have before. But he was somebody who very much saw it as his job to try to get the best people in politics to form the government, rather than go down the route of going for either the Whigs or the Tories. He was a great one for sort of coalition government, national governments, and taking the best people from each party, which was an unpopular thing with the politicians, but quite popular, I think, with the public overall.
Now, he had many interests and was obviously an inquiring mind. He was famously very interested in farming, but also exploration, art, music, astronomy, and geology. But what I wanted to know is, would he make an entertaining dinner guest?
Oh, I think so, yes. I'd love to have dinner with George III. Absolutely. There are so many areas that you could talk to him. His conversations, the ones we know about, such as the famous one with Samuel Johnson, who came to his library in Buckingham House, and the king allowed strangers to just come in and use his library, scholars and ordinary members of the public. And it was a wonderful library, 80,000 books, which of course forms the centre of the British Library today. And he had a wonderful conversation with him. He had a wonderful conversation also with Fanny Burney, who was a courtier of his wife's, Queen Charlotte's. And so, yes, I think he'd make an extremely entertaining dinner guest.
Now, he was a very faithful husband and sober. As a biographer, does it sometimes feel a little frustrating writing about such a virtuous figure, when in the past you've written about less luxurious subjects and ones
no.
Oh, good.
It was a bit of a relief, frankly. It means you only have to concentrate on one wife rather than an endless supply of mistresses. I hasten to add that Winston Churchill was also, who I wrote about previously, was also uxorious and faithful to his wife. But as far as sex is concerned, my book teems with it, because of course his uncles, his brothers, and his sons were all but a couple of them at least, were all amazing rakes who built up huge debts. One of his sons had 10 illegitimate children. George was nonplussed sometimes about the extraordinary extent to which his family were able to indulge in debauchery. So no, you don't have to worry for me on that score. There's plenty of debauchery.
It was during his reign that we see the Act of Union with Ireland and the creation of the Union flag in 1801. But this resulted in disagreement with Pitt the Younger over Catholic emancipation. Now, is there any evidence here that George could have been a little bit more pragmatic when dealing with his subjects? But more importantly, was the lack of Catholic emancipation in the Act of Union or subsequent to the Act of Union, was this laying the groundwork for a future split from the Union for Ireland?
Again, as a constitutional monarch, George III couldn't force through or really go along with Catholic emancipation when the huge majority of the House of Commons and the House of Lords were against it. Yes, Pitt the Younger, even Pitt the Younger couldn't bring the whole of his cabinet with him, or at best half of his cabinet. If it had gone to a vote in the Commons at the time that he came up with in 1801 and the Lords, it would have been voted down by large majorities. And it wasn't. George III did not consider it his duty to overthrow the view of the House of Commons all the time. What he did think also was that he had taken an oath at the coronation to protect the Protestant religion and to alter the constitution so much that you allow Catholics the vote was as far as he was concerned, he was a very pious and serious Christian and believing Anglican and so on, that this was going to be a revolutionary thing to do and quite against his coronation oath. And when one thinks that only 20 years earlier, you had 400 people killed in central London in the Gordon riots over precisely this, it was a sort of terrible Protestant backlash against some fairly minor advances of relief of the Catholics. What might have happened in London, especially in wartime, of course, it's 1801, you have a threat from France, it doesn't bear thinking about. So yes, it seems to us to be appalling that Catholics in Ireland didn't have the vote, but it was part of the 1688-89 settlement that created that situation, and that's what he owed his crown to, and he wasn't about to rip all that up in order to essentially what he saw as sort of appeasing the papists.
Now, moving on to his mental illness, the first bout of which seems to have occurred in 1788.
Well, I take issue with that, actually.
Yeah,
I argued that it was a bit earlier than that the first bout, what's called the prodrome of his mental illness, took place in 1765. I think I'm one of the first historians only historian, should I say, to argue that.
And could you talk a little bit about his mental illness, starting from that first episode?
Yes, the first episode was a very light one, but in 1788, as you mentioned, and then on to the early months of 1789, he suffered from a severe attack of what I am certain was manic depression, was bipolar disorder, not porphyria, which is a physical disease that he was diagnosed with in the 1960s as the result of a very dodgy sort of campaign by a mother and her son, who only gave the doctors, in my view at least, biased evidence to suggest it was this physical disease porphyria, because they didn't believe that there were such things as mental illnesses. They thought everything was down to the physical. So we're able to see a king who could himself watch himself slipping into this degree of horrific lunacy, and he was treated according to the precepts of the time, but what we would today consider to be appalling, with long bouts of in straitjackets and handcuffed to a chair virtually. It was a terrible period in which he had to show tremendous courage, indeed, but it was a mental illness and not a physical one. And I've gone to Sir Simon Wesley, the president of the Royal College of Medicine and so on, and I've talked to the top porphyria experts, and they all agree that this has been misdiagnosed for half a century. When you see in the Alan Bennett play The Madness of King George and the movie, they both attribute it to porphyria, but that's simply, I think, a completely outdated prognosis now.
Now, his mental illness, the causes of it, I mean, there are many struggles that he did have in his life, such as you mentioned his son's behavior. There's obviously America, and there was his personal tragedy as well with his youngest daughter. Why do you think we've clung on to this view of the mad king when there are these perfectly understandable reasons for his illness?
Because I'm afraid it's because of of Dr. McAlpine and her son, Dr. Hunter, who, I go into this in the appendix in some detail, which I think readers will find interesting. I'm afraid quite a lot of it is to do with the colour of feces and urine. don't read it over breakfast, but it's quite clear that the feces and urine go a porphyric colour, i.e. purple, under this. However, there were various things that he ate, some medicines he took, beetroot and so on, which can do that. And the times that did happen were the ones that doctors Hunter and McAlpine sent to the 1960s doctors, and they, not unreasonably, assumed therefore it was porphyria. What they didn't do was to send the evidence of hundreds of times when the king's pee and poo were perfectly normal colours during these outbreaks. So it was a pretty, I'm afraid to say, intellectually dishonest way to go about it back in the late 1960s.
Now, George worked with a number of prime ministers during his long reign. Which of them served him best, and which of them let down their king and country?
Well, he only had two geniuses out of the dozen or so prime ministers. Probably more than a dozen. I ought to add them up. He and they were the father and son, Pitt the elder and Pitt the younger. The trouble is, he got Pitt the elder too late. By that stage, he was suffering from some extraordinary thing, but essentially it was terminal gout, which had affected his. In those days, you couldn't take allopurinol or Ocoxia like I do, but you have to. In those days, you had to just deal with it as best you could, and it is the most phenomenally painful disease, and it drove Pitt the elder mad, and so he was no good at a key time in the run up to the American rebellion. And then his son, Pitt the Younger, was utterly wonderful, was one of the greatest prime ministers. I put him in the top 3 prime ministers of all time. And unfortunately, of course, as we mentioned earlier, he had to resign over Catholic emancipation, but he did at least come back later in 1804. And he was inspired, but then again, he died tremendously early and tragically in 1806. So he was unlucky with his prime ministers. Quite a lot of them were perfectly reasonable, sort of good-natured people. Lots of them were ideological Whigs, like Lord Rockingham. That some were absolutely useless, like Lord North, who, although he was a charming and good-natured person and a fine manager of the House of Commons, was a completely abominable war leader who kept trying to resign, quite rightly, and saying that he didn't understand anything about war. But George III wrongly kept him in place because there was nobody else to continue the war of any kind of stature equal to his. And George III can be and is, but in my book, criticised for letting Lord North carry on years after. He was actually Prime Minister for 12 years, which is pretty extraordinary. So all in all, you have this pretty bad ruck of prime ministers, many of them very unpopular, like the Earl of Bute, and only 2 geniuses, of whom one died early and the other was too ill to be of much use.
Rather poorly served then. Lord North seems, he's always in the top 3 of worst prime ministers ever.
Yes, he jostles Neville Chamberlain and I don't know, Anthony Eden all the time, doesn't he? We might, yes, exactly. I'm not going to bring it forward any further. I don't think that would be necessarily fair to some of the more modern prime ministers. But no, those Lord Norths are definitely up there in the worst 3.
So, last question, Andrew. Now, he lived in an age of great men, and 3 that spring to mind are Napoleon, Wellington, and Washington. But does George III belong in their company?
No, because he's not a soldier, and also because in the case of Napoleon, he certainly was not a dictator. One of the arguments I constantly try to make in this book is that he just doesn't fit into the definition of a tyrant in any way. He's not a genius on the battlefield at all, like Napoleon and Wellington were, and he wasn't in a sense, he was the father of his country, like Washington, but he was obviously a conservative figure and not a revolutionary. So No, I'm not arguing at all that he was one of the key figures of all ages, really, with Napoleon, Wellington, and Washington. But what I am arguing is that he was wildly misunderstood, deeply underappreciated, that he was a good and fine man, that he was a man devoted to the Constitution, somebody who took very interesting stances on lots of things, who, instead of being called a brute by Thomas Paine, should be admired as the person who built up half of the Royal Collection, which is one of the greatest art collection in private hands in the world. He helped finance the largest telescope in the world. He sent Captain Cook off with money to Australia to track the transit of Venus in 1769. He was a real Renaissance prince, and yet somebody who is generally considered to be one of the worst kings. So I think he's ripe for a revision.
Absolutely, and that's a great way to end it. A Renaissance prince. I'm reading it at the moment. I'm racing through it. It's compelling. I'm really enjoying it. Readers of Aspects of History will have a treat next month, because we've got a piece from you dealing with his mental illness. So that's going to be very interesting. I recommend that. But Andrew, most of all, thank you very much for your time, and best of luck with George III.
You are kind, Oliver. Thank you very much indeed. I've much enjoyed this conversation.